Welcome to Builders, the podcast for leaders who want to build great company. I'm your host, Alex Snyder, strategic advisor to world-class builders. This podcast dives into the wild rides and personal transformations that come with pursuing big dreams and becoming a leader who builds incredible teams and companies. Each episode, I'm joined by a guest who helps deliver a fresh perspective designed to leave you feeling less lonely, more connected to innovative ideas, and inspired about growing your business your way. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite channel, leave us a 5-star review, and share your favorite episode with a friend. The podcast is sponsored by Alex Snyder Advisory. If you are a business leader or executive team ready to take your leadership and company to the next level with a high-performing team, we'd love to see how we can rocket fuel your growth. Check out the show notes to book your free Builders Business Booster call, where you'll receive a strategic leadership audit and 3 concrete focus areas to mature and grow your business. All right, thanks for tuning in. Let's build. Welcome, Sydney. Thank you so much for joining me. I think it's extra cool to have 2 generations of powerful Piggott ladies in this season. I love that. And I actually really love it because in addition to just being a shining example of following your passions and really making some incredible contributions to the world, I think you have one of those jobs that many people don't even know exists or is an option for them. And so I am so excited to have you here. I think there's about 100 topics. Okay, maybe like nine topics that we could cover. So we'll do our best to navigate through it. And yeah, I think there's going to be some really amazing value and some cool angles that are a little different from other guests this season. So I always like to ask if you can just introduce yourself because I'm never going to do justice to it.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, Alex. It's really cool to be here in this capacity because we've known each other for such a long time since I was in my undergrad in university, which is now over 10 years ago. And like you mentioned, you had my mom on here before too. So it's cool to follow in her footsteps, which I do a lot, as we'll talk about. But yeah, I'm Sydney. I do a lot of things, but my day job is that I am a senior social impact manager at Shopify, which is an e-commerce tech company. It basically enables small, medium, large businesses to run their businesses online and in brick and mortar stores. It's a Canadian company, so that's also a really cool connection that we have. And on top of my day job, I do a ton of other work. I always say that your career is so much more than your job. And so I do a lot of community work, a lot of volunteer work. I also research and write on cash transfer programs and inclusive economies. So, how do we make the economic landscape more equal for people around the world? I also do a lot of work in the gender equity space. I work in a few organizations here in Canada, some international ones as well. And I talk a lot about financial inclusion, gender equity, intersectionality, a bunch of different stuff. And then we talked about it before, but the most recent, I guess, accomplishments that I have is that a couple weeks ago, I was at the Commission on the Status of Women in New York talking about a chapter in a book that I co-wrote recently that talks about cash transfer programs and how we can use them to reach hardest to reach populations. So that's a little bit of what I do. I know we'll get into it more, but yeah, just a few things that I do.
I love it. Thank you for sharing. And yeah, for those of us joining us, that's a lot. We're going to dig into it. Some of those terms might be new to people. I do think it's really cool you work for Shopify. They used to be down the street from our startup in
Oh,
the day. And Shopify is like one of the unicorns that has really like come up and become a massive global player. Even if you don't recognize the name and you're listening, you've probably shopped on one of their sites that's powered by Shopify. So it has really become an industry leader. And I think it is so cool that there are jobs within this organization that is, growing rapidly and needs all kinds of roles targeted at just the business, but that there are these roles in social impact. And so I would love to, I guess I'd like to start a little bit more at the beginning. As you said, you and I have known each other for quite a long time. So I've gotten to watch you do amazing things. And when we met, you were in your undergrad and you were already getting involved in social impact and community. I know more recently you were in Ethiopia for a project. So can you give us a little bit of an idea of like where did community and social impact start in terms of an interest or a passion for you? Maybe how your upbringing influenced how you approach life and work in community?
That is such a good question. And it's so true. People, even the term social impact, I think is relatively new when it comes to this corporate space. It was always like corporate social responsibility, which felt really serious instead of this kind of broader term of social impact. But yeah, where it all started, when I did my undergrad at McGill, I was studying international development studies and history. So those were the two things I was researching and getting into. Like I said, that was almost 15 years ago now. And a big part of why I wanted to do it was, like you said, people in my family were just amazing role models for wanting to do this work. So my grandmother worked for the World Bank for a long time, and I would go visit her in Washington, D.C. and kind of see what she was working on. My grandfather, too, is like really into social justice. Really, all of my grandparents, even though they're from 4 different countries, they all had this way of sticking up for other people or these kind of community movements. They would like go to protests or they would write letters to the editor in the newspaper. They would write articles about their convictions on these different things. So I was really fortunate to be in a family that this was part of the culture. And of course, my parents then were also raised with that culture. And my mom, she's one of those champions as well, especially for gender equity, racial justice, things like that. So I really did have a ton of role models in my own family. Also, just the experience, like I grew up in Montreal, not the most diverse place ever, especially compared to now living in Toronto. So I was one of few in class or in my jobs and things like that. So it was a personal experience, it was a family experience. And then going to university allowed me to be like, oh, there's actually a whole space that does this type of work, but it's also huge. And like, how am I going to find where I'm going to be able to like figure something out? So yeah, it's changed a bunch of times. And now my niche is really more like gender equity, intersectionality, financial inclusion. But yeah, it all started with just like, I have all these influences. I want to learn something. So I started at my undergrad studying international development. Yeah. And then from there, it was also a lot of twists and turns. My first job out of my undergrad was actually working for in logistics for a clothing company, which sounds like completely not related. But we were looking into like how clothes are made and what are the conditions in the factories and just making sure that we had some knowledge of how our supply chain looked and if it was ethical, if it was meeting labor standards. And that's when I was like, oh, okay, like I could do this for a job. I could get paid to do this. And since it wasn't the main part of my job, I decided to pursue a master's degree. So that's when I moved to Toronto. I studied global affairs at the University of Toronto. And that's when I was like really realizing, okay, this is something that I could do long term. So there's when I did research in Ethiopia. I did work in South Africa as well with youth attending university. I wrote a bunch of papers on a bunch of things related to financial inclusion. I got involved in the Reach Alliance, which I'm on the advisory council for now, which is a research lab that really focuses on reaching hard to reach populations. So it was just a great way to expand my knowledge of the states. And I also ended up getting my first job in a nonprofit. So I worked at YWCA Canada as a translator. I got a 1 month contract as a translator. And then I was like, I like working here. I hope there's more opportunities. And yeah, they hired me as a project coordinator afterwards. I became a manager and then a director all within like 3 to 4 years. And that kind of got my expertise in like the gender space, basically.
I love that you touched on so many things. Like, if you're listening, like social impact, which I like that you separate it from like corporate social responsibility, because that was the term when I was coming through like my master's. And I was really interested in it because I did think like, oh, it's interesting to consider like, how can you expect companies to be good corporate citizens? It particularly I ended up in mining, right? Where like they're beholden to commodity price markets, which fluctuate. Thinking of it as a company, a little bit the same as a person, your hierarchy of needs, like as a human, you you have to get some basic things in place before you can really like even consider helping others, right? And obviously we all know like some people are saints and they manage to do it without pouring into their cup and whatever. But let's put the cliche and the science and say like, yes, you got to have a certain level of your needs met or fill your cup to be able to give. I was like, oh, it's interesting because I have a direct background in psychology and then I went into business. I was like, companies are not that different,
Yeah.
right? Like we can expect them to be better, but if they aren't stable or confident in the fact that they're going to have enough money to run their business and stay open, how do we really expect them to commit resources to other things and to operate better and impact the people in their communities, right? So for better or for worse, like for me, it was more pragmatic. It wasn't like, oh, poor companies, how could we? Yeah, I expect them to be better, but like, what's the reality, right?
Yeah.
And that was the interest that took me into strategy and operations was like, well, if we could help companies operate better and reliably and be stabilized, then they could have bandwidth to be better corporate citizens. But I think social impact is like a nice, not nice, I guess it's like a broader term now that I
Mhm.
think can apply in the corporate space, in the startup space, in the community, in your day to day life. And I think it's nice because I don't think those things should be so separate, which you're
Exactly.
really
Yeah.
low. And I love that you touched on supply chain. I think it wouldn't be the first thing that comes to mind, but the moment you started explaining, well, understanding where our clothes come from and who is working along the supply chain and what conditions they work in, suddenly you're like, well, of course, that's a huge component. That makes so much sense. But the same might be true if you were in a different industry and you were looking at like maybe like byproduct and waste of what
Yeah.
you're making. Like, where is that going? Like, that's a whole nother department that actually is huge in terms of its impact. And I think the list goes on and on. And there are obviously something like the YWCA is just, it's part of their core principles and focus in a way that's a little
Exactly.
bit
Yeah.
different. So, how did, I guess, going through those different types of roles and types of organizations shape what you want to do and where you're landed? And I guess how you see, because you impact through your role, clearly, it's in your title, but then you also do a lot outside of your role in academia, in research, in publications, in speaking. Is that intentional?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great way that you reflect on it too, because I know that you have so much experience working in different sectors and that corporate social responsibility versus social impact it's changed so much in that time. And I agree with the way that you positioned it as like thinking of yourself as a person and then also thinking of like the company that you work for, the space that you're working in, also with like a person with needs and like different things that are, I guess, like trade-offs or parameters that you have to work within. So it leads into why I have like a larger career than just my day-to-day job. I really liked what you said around like looking at the constraints that exist, right? You do strategy and operations, so you understand that even though people want companies to do more or do things differently or whatever it is, even for me, I don't know all of the different factors that are at play. Like companies are huge, they have a lot of different stakeholders. And sometimes you're like, okay, well, I love my job. I love what I do. I love that we at Shopify really focus on like this ecosystem approach. So we're trying to make commerce better for everyone. So part of that means that we're working with young people who are not on Shopify. They're not starting a business, but we understand that they need to learn certain skills and technology, entrepreneurial mindset. They need mentorship, they need support, and those types of things are important. But I also understand that there's only so much that my company is going to do to impact this broader space of like financial inclusion, economic empowerment, specifically for like women and gender diverse people or racialized minorities. So that's why I expand outside of my day to day job to do other stuff. And like you mentioned, there's two paths that I take. One is the thought leadership part. So that's what you were saying around I write articles and different publications on the research that I've done on cash transfers or on financial inclusion for women and youth or different things that I got from my master's life or my traditional academic life, but also from working at YWCA. It gave me a lot of exposure to people all over the world and their experiences and how that we can learn from those no matter where we are. And then I also do speaking engagements talking about some of this work as well. And then the community side is really investing in other people. I think we've talked about this personally, but I've been really fortunate to have a ton of mentors in my life. You're included as one of those. You helped me. I remember when I first moved to Toronto, you were in Toronto too, and you took time to meet up with me, chat with me, help me orient myself. Like you had known me since I was a kid, like living at home with my parents when this was my first time moving to another city. And you've been helpful, like so helpful with so many things in my life since then, right? My mom's been that person. I've had other mentors, definitely through YWCA. I learned so much through mentors that I've had there. And so that's why community building is really important to me because I know that I wouldn't be here if it weren't for people like you. So that's why mentorship is something that I try to continue doing. If I see young folks who are like, I don't know what I want to do, but I'm interested in social impact. I don't know if I want to work for a nonprofit or work for the United Nations or work for a company like you. And I share that you don't really have to choose. You can do it all, right? Like I worked in nonprofit for over 5 years. After YWCA, was a director at another organization called Elevate that focused on tech. And that's what allowed me to now work in a corporate setting. So you don't really have to choose one or the other. You can expand and try out things and learn new things. So if I can pay that forward to people in my community who might not have that mentorship or that example, I'll always do it. And I was really fortunate too that all four of my grandparents went to university. Both of my parents went to university. I'm not a first in my family to navigate those really challenging spaces. I have a lot of like women in my family who are like that high power professional. So I know that's, a privilege to have those examples. And so I know that not everybody does have that. And investing in community in that way is important. I also do less like fun grassroots stuff and more like serious governance stuff, which I think has been really helpful for me to learn like what these spaces of power look like and how you can influence them and the allies that you can create there. So I've been on boards, advisory committees, and councils, a lot of things like that since I was maybe 25 or 26. And it really helped me to learn about those spaces and how you can influence change in those spaces as well. So yeah, I do have those 3 prongs, I guess, like my day job and like the kind of corporate social impact space, the more research focused thought leadership space, and then the community and really grassroots driven work that powers all that other motivation, I guess.
Right. I love that you talked about the job transitions as well, because I think that is, I always say entrepreneurship is not the most, doesn't have to be defined by like starting a company for profit. And I think you really have the entrepreneurial spirit, which is very fueled by passion, very hardworking, and also like when we have a startup, often whatever the first idea is and what goes to market. And there's a lot of permutations. And I think your career trajectory is a little bit like that, right? Like there's a foundation and there are threads that tie it together, and you're pursuing how to achieve X. But like the way in which you're getting there is has evolved, and I love the term skill stacking, and I'm not sure where it comes from. Possibly Alex Ramosi, the idea that you can do a certain thing that has X value and you can only go so far in that and differentiate so much. But then if you like add Y thing to that and then you add X thing to that and then W and you become this. I think he gave a really good example of like JC basically. He was like, he had rhythm and then he figured out how to like rap and then he figured out how to identify that in others and then he figured out how to like market and then and right and like I think the joke was like and then he figured out Beyonce, which is like a same achievement, right? But like that idea that like by adding different capabilities together, you can bring to the market something increasingly unique and valuable. And I think when I hear you talk about not only going from nonprofits into an impact role in a for-profit, but also the fact that you are doing research. So you are actually like at the source and then you are able to write, which I do a little bit and it is not easy. And then also get up and speak about it. And so you really have like this interesting mix that allows you to like come from a lot of different perspectives and bring really unique insight. I'm wondering, I love talking about entrepreneurship and leadership. So we're going to talk
Let's do
about
it.
that. How has your experience shaped your idea of leadership? And I guess, how does that manifest in any or all of these roles that we're talking about?
Yeah, I love this question. I feel like I've more recently really solidified my sense of leadership or like what I expect for myself, what I expect for others, and things like that. And it comes from so many different experiences. One, I think that you would really relate to, we chatted a bit about it before, was I went from being very generalist to trying to create a bit of an expertise, exactly like you were saying, like layering on top of what I already knew. I think both you and I did like professional degrees, right? Like you did an MBA, I did a master's of global affairs, and they kind of applaud that generalist thinking, right? Because especially when you're in consulting, it's like you need to be able to hop from project to project and
Figure
do
it
different
out.
things. Exactly. And so that's really valued. And I think that's great because it gives you that solid foundation to be like, you know what, I can tackle any problem, which is important. So in my like leadership thinking, I like to come into things thinking like, I can figure this out. I have the skills, the basic skills to be able to do this. But the thing that I was lacking a lot, especially after finishing my master's degree, is that I didn't really have expertise in anything in particular. So I felt like from a leadership perspective, I did have to become a expert in something, right? I had to still like those generalist skills, but be like, okay, but what do I add that's different from every person who's done this type of degree or every person who's done this type of work? And so that's when my leadership went more into like a subject matter expertise. So I was like, I care about gender equity. I care about economic empowerment and financial inclusion. I'm going to focus on the intersection of those two things. And so that's why I like deepened my research. I deepened my practice. I took on like director level roles when they were available and really focused on, even if my title wasn't specific to that, bringing that lens to everything I was doing. So that was a big part of it from like the, I guess, like theoretical approach. Being a generalist, being able to tackle lots of different issues, but then also being able to dive deeper into certain subjects that are really important to the work. And that shows up in my work too at Shopify now. Like we do a lot of programs that focus on underrepresented communities. In fact,
Yes.
all of our programs do. So that intersectional approach is super important and you need an expertise in that. But then I also need like general like communications experience and program management and stakeholder engagement and those types of things that I'm more of a generalist at. So that's the theory of it. And then in terms of like how I came to adopt like the model of leadership that I have now, it's definitely like more horizontal. So I don't really love like the hierarchical way of thinking. I don't really love to always lead teams. Like sometimes I have huge teams and I love doing that. I love fostering talent. So that's something that's great. But more recently, I've been like, you know what? I think I need to lead myself and develop this way of being more independent and being able to be a little bit more adaptable. And so that's why working for a tech company has been really helpful for me, right? I'm learning at a pace, I'm leading things rather than people, like leading creation of products or leading programs, leading a portfolio. So that's really interesting as well. And I think that how I learned this, and you can probably relate to this deeply, is like having great role models and then having terrible role models. So you almost learn more
You
from
have to
people who
have
are like,
both. You
right?
can't just have great shining examples your whole life and be like,
Exactly.
okay, cool, I'm gonna follow that. Like there have to be things in life that show you what you don't want to be. I think
Exactly.
maybe that's just how I just built life suboptimal experiences. So I do
So
think it's
true.
like you need to see both to understand it. Even if you
Exactly.
can be like on a theory, right? You can learn it's like if you learn theory but you never experience it, you're never gonna have the same level of depth and understanding. I think it's the
Mm,
same of like in the reality, yes, of course it helps to have good role models and people that you can identify and emulate traits. But I do think also there is a level of like understanding of like feeling the impact of people that you don't want to emulate and really
exactly.
understanding what that experience is like that can help you, that can help fuel your determination to be the person you want to be because we're all fallible humans, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's like, if you don't really know what it's like to work for somebody that just has a couple of those really undesirable leadership traits and you don't know how demoralizing and like how much your heart sinks in your pit of your stomach and how like you don't know what to do and you don't want to come in and whatever it is that like your reaction to that is, if you don't know that feeling, I don't think you can fully grasp the gravity and importance of the other side of the spectrum, or if you felt both sides of the spectrum, then you can be like, do I ever want to make anyone feel this way? No. Do I want to make people feel this way? Yes. Okay. I'm really driven by that. Right. And I think if you look at this is a bit of a leap of logic, but like anyone who is doing really meaningful things in the world, there's usually some experience, and it's often like not a great one, that fuels that drive to like really exemplify what they want to see and be in the world. And so I think on a more day to day, you're absolutely right. You have to have both sides of the coin.
You have to. And it's like you're talking about entrepreneurship as well. It's kind of part of that. Like you have to be comfortable with a level of failure. And I think that if you don't see that modeled in a way, you can't really understand that, right? It's hard to be able to say that you failed at something or to be rejected from something. And that type of fear can really keep you from pursuing different things, whether it's starting a business or writing that paper that seems really daunting or speaking at that event that has 10,000 people at it or completely pivoting your career to something you never thought you would do. And I think that not to say that poor role models are like better than good role models. That's definitely not the truth. But I think for example of something that you don't like or that looks like a failure or that looks like something that is really daunting, it can be helpful to have experiences. And exactly like you said, I mean, you studied psychology, so I don't need to say this to you, but maybe for people watching is that adverse reaction is actually a lot stronger than a positive reaction. And so sometimes like going through those trials will actually leave a longer mark on you than these smaller, more positive things that can happen. And so that's definitely the case for me. And it also taught me that the biggest thing I was missing from those people was a level of accountability and transparency, which is usually a good way to just solve it. When there's failures, I think a lot of people go into like crisis mode and like they want to paint it as something that's positive, and as a result, it impacts everyone around them in a negative way. Cause it's like, oh, well, this wasn't my fault. Like, you didn't do this, and this person didn't deliver this on time. And so, what I learned from that is like leadership has to be accountable, has to be transparent. Even if you're making mistakes, like, you have to be able to own that and admit that. And so that's been a huge part of it. And not to say that I want like bad leaders in my life. Like I definitely prefer to be like working under leadership that's like great and encouraging and motivating. But at the same time, for people watching who might be like, oh, like I'm working with this person who's leading me that I really don't feel is aligning with the way that I want to be led. If first, like you can manage up, like you can express that if you're in a safe enough environment, but also like you can learn from that experience as well. As long as there's no like harm being caused, like you can be like, okay, when I get into this position, I'm not going to do that, or I'm going to approach this differently. So yeah, that's definitely like been a part of the leadership journey. And I think it's helped me. Of course, you've also learned what you can't control. I think that's sometimes why leadership is not great. It can feel like a lot of pressure. And of course, that pressure can come out in good and bad ways. I won't say that I've never done that, right? Like there's been moments where I'm like really in over my head and I'm like, I can't do this, that I'm taking it out on other people. But just being able to like reflect, apologize, change course, I think is really important.
Absolutely. I love that you said that. And I think, of course, there's always going to be a spectrum. And it'd be great if the spectrum trends to like great leaders become greater and not so great leaders become slightly better, slightly less work. But there's always going to be that spectrum. And there's also, I do believe, even though obviously I have my view on how I like to lead and certain traits and characteristics that I think are more optimal, there are different leadership styles, right? And they work for different people and for different teams and for different contexts and for different cultures. And all there are a million and one variables that go into that. So there is no like, and this probably goes against all the books I read, and even if you've heard me speak on it, what you would think from that. But there isn't one way to lead. There isn't one specific formula of like things, right? But there are, to your point, in psychology and organizational behavior, a lot of things that most of us can take on board to be better leaders within the context of our personalities, environment, culture, and team. I guess to that point, you work on diversity and inclusion and a lot of other things, but I'm wondering, how does that come to play in how you see teams and how leading teams, working in teams, how teams collaborate, how they solve problems? What's your experience been with that?
That's a great question, especially because I have a lot of different kind of team experience. I've been like a director of a team of people who do all different roles and diverse in their experiences and their knowledge, even in what they do every day. And I've also worked in like research teams where there isn't really a hierarchy, like everybody is contributing in a similar way, but we also have diverse expertise and experiences. We have to work in cross cultural context, right? Like working in Ethiopia, doing research in a different place. You have to understand that context on top of your whole team. And then I've also been in a place where it's like, I'm not the leader of the team, but I'm a leader of a part of the work, right? And so you have to act as an expert in this really diverse space. So I'll try and identify the three things that really stood out to me from all of those experiences. The first one is, you know, getting input as much as possible from other people at the beginning, I think is really important in the way that you communicate. So I think that the biggest challenge for really diverse teams is communication is not the same for everybody. I know, especially when you think about like neurodiversity or cultural relativity in these spaces, there's different ways. Like some people culturally, they won't share when they need help or need support. And I think especially like women tend to do that as well because you don't want to be looked at as someone who's like not competent. Racialized people too. Like you don't want to look like you don't know things. So that becomes a really big challenge. For neurodiversity, some people just don't receive information in the same way. So you can be like feeling as a leader that you're sharing appropriately and then getting a different result. And you're like, why can't this person do this? And it's not their fault. It's like your responsibility as a leader to ask them, how should this be communicated to you? What can I do to support you to accomplish these things? So I learned that really early on, like the first time I ever managed someone, a similar situation where I was like, okay, I'm like saying this, but I'm not really getting the outcome that I want. And I realized like this is actually on me to set up norms around communication that works for people from different experiences, different identities, different tenure as well. So that was like the first big learning is that you're working with diverse teams or in diverse contexts, making sure that you have these kind of norms for your engagement together is really important. I think as a leader as well, this is the second point, is being able to show up for people as a group, but also individually. I think like managers don't always do this well. Like they don't really create the space to foster that like coaching, mentorship, allyship, support relationship with people. They just like feel that they can give direction and then people will just follow it. So I definitely think with diverse teams and any team really, it's like you need to create that time. You need to be able to have the one-on-one time with people, but also bring people together around a common goal and objective. And that especially when people are coming from different perspectives, I find that being really goal oriented is helpful because then you don't have to, well, you don't feel necessarily like things are biased. Like you can come to be like, this is the goal that we're accomplishing as a team. Would love to get everyone's input. Like, how do we feel about it? Would love to hear these different perspectives, but we're all working towards this goal. And so that's been really helpful for me too, is creating that space, identifying those goals, being really transparent with communication. And then the last part is leaning on external support. I think that a lot of the time, and companies often, I think, do this wrong, is that they leave it all on the manager, the leader, the director to take on every single issue that will come up. But we're not always experts in doing that and can actually cause more harm than good, especially if there is some unconscious bias or if it's just in a situation you've never encountered before, right? So I think that building those additional supports outside, like, oh, you can access this coaching or this employee assistance or this business partner who can help you, it's super important. And I think that we don't talk about leadership as somebody who relies on other people. You talk about leadership as someone who like knows how to do everything right and they can't make mistakes, right? So, especially with diverse teams, like access those supports, make sure that your team knows where they can access those supports and don't try and be an expert on everything because that's when you start to cause harm unintentionally, but you can do it because you don't have any outside sources looking in, right? You can become very like self-centered and self-righteous and not from a negative perspective. It's just part of like how we kind of view leadership, especially I think in like a work setting, like not necessarily just corporate setting, but just any work setting. Like it's very hierarchical. You feel like you have to show up in a certain way. And so when you need help, you're like, I'm not a leader anymore. Like I'm not doing it right.
Which is the opposite, right? Like the best leaders surround themselves with people who know what they don't know and they understand where they need help. So I love that you brought that up. And I love that you brought up the leader's responsibility to learn how to communicate with the individuals in the team and to learn about them. I think that we don't talk enough about, culture and neurodivergence and just the fact that people, for a variety of different reasons, will intake information in different ways. And having worked across a lot of cultures myself, being someone who is neurodivergent, I remember going through school and realizing like teachers need there's so many students in the class who like just couldn't intake
Yeah.
what the way that and so I always had this view growing up that like a good teacher is someone who can explain something in multiple ways. I love that you brought that up because I think it's just a life skill that will serve you well regardless of what you do, but particularly as a leader. And I've had this reminder myself in my business in the last few weeks where something went a little bit sideways and I was like, cool, yes, there's problems to be dealt with and I need to hold people accountable. But the reality is, it's my responsibility. Everything in this business is my responsibility, right? And
Yeah.
even if the responsibility is, oh, you didn't terminate somebody when you should have, and they are still in that role and they're not doing a great job and they're impacting others, or that responsibility is you didn't set expectations and hold people to them and communicate. Like, of course, there's responsibility and accountability in other individuals, but as a leader, like the buck stops with you. And so,
Exactly.
and I think that there are a lot of opportunities for people to brush those things off as like a difficult person in a team or whatever. And the reality is, great leadership is somebody who figures out to overcome that either themselves or to your point, by leveraging other people to help them. So I think
Yeah.
I love that. And I would love to know a little bit of, or if you think it's relevant or even just to transition to, you talk about non-traditional academia and research and writing a book. Like I imagine that the individuals you interact with in that realm are quite different from your corporate or startup realm. And the language and not necessarily like English versus others, but just the dialects of conversation and the subject matter is so different.
Yes,
I would
it
love
is.
to kind of hear about that. I guess maybe for people who don't know, like, why is it non-traditional academia? You're not going and becoming a tenured professor just yet.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see. I know that there's a lot of hope for that from some outside forces, but it probably won't happen. It's a really great question. I feel like everything that I have done, especially like since entering the workforce, has been non-traditional. So like that I've honored that in different parts of my life as well. But I think it's just we're able to change the way that we approach things. Like we don't have to do things in a certain path that's been outlined. So if you think about work, for example, there's really like, even though they say, oh, like non-linear, like get a lot of experiences, when you actually work at a company, it's very hierarchical and very linear, right? It's like you start a job at one level, you get promoted, you manage people, like you just go up this corporate ladder, if you will. And that's how you're rewarded, right? Even if you're like, I don't really want to manage people, like I'm actually just really good at this thing and I want to keep doing that. Actually, what's cool about Shopify is that they had that system. Like you don't need to necessarily like become a manager to get a promotion, which is nice. But most companies are not like that. And academia is even more like that, right? You do really, it's really constrained what you can do. Like you do an undergrad, you do a master's, you have to like make friends with a bunch of professors so that you can get a bunch of reference letters to do a PhD. And then you become a professor and it's very precarious until you're tenured. And then you just stay there and you're untouchable for the rest of your career. And what's really interesting in that sense for me is universities should be places where people are really like pushing the envelope and being innovative and thinking differently. But that kind of traditional path doesn't really incentivize that, right? Which is why you're seeing so many tech companies like not caring about degrees anymore. Or some of these like new startups, people are like, yeah, I didn't even finish my undergrad. Like I just had this idea and I started doing it. And it's because those constraints really inhibit people's like creativity. It forces people, like you said, to speak a certain way. How many times did you read an article in school, in university, and you're like, I don't know what this says. Like, I have no idea what the people are talking about. This language is ridiculous. And then you end up writing something yourself and you're like, yeah, you don't have to. Like there was very like simple language that could have been used to say the exact same thing. But there's this idea that like you're better than other people because like you
I was
have a
gonna
PhD,
say
you
there's like
know?
an exclusionary element,
Exactly.
really unfortunate because I think, you know, as somebody who I friends in my life will say like I have a big vocabulary. I love words. I love to read. My challenge when I am creating something is like I want everyone to understand this. And if you follow people who talk about communication or writing or copywriting, it's how do you get it down to and I can't remember what the grade is, but I'm gonna say like grade 7 level. That's what newspapers are written at. That's because that is what allows people and it's odd to think that if you are really working on groundbreaking ideas, that you wouldn't want everyone to be able to read them and access them. But I
That's
know actually,
exactly it.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's like the other thing about it is that you are forced into a path where you can't bring things to the world. Like things have to be like completely finished and like done and dusted before you can even release them. In publication, that's a huge thing, right? Which is great. There's reasons for that, like having peer reviewed articles and like having more than one study that says the same thing, or else you get people like spewing nonsense all over the internet. And you're like, okay, that's also not good. But one of the things that I really liked from my journey, and this is really like I owe this to the Reach Alliance, which I'm on the advisory council for now, but I was a researcher with that consortium back in 2017 and 2018, is that they really created that space for me. So we did research in interdisciplinary teams. You could have an undergrad all the way up to a PhD. You could have like medical students, law students, like anyone who would had an interest in studying how to reach hard to reach populations could join. So you had to like apply, obviously, and go through interview processes. But once you were there, you were working with all different levels. You had faculty mentors rather than supervisors who really like mentored you and made sure that you could think critically about things and approach things in an interdisciplinary way. So that was really cool. And then since then, like we published our case study while I was still doing my master's. And now it's like how many years later, 5 years later, and we're still, writing for Stanford Social Innovation Review. And we're writing, like co-writing these book chapters and speaking at different conferences about the work that we're doing. And it's like this was an intentional space that was created for people like me who don't want to do a PhD and don't want to become a professor, but are still like smart and want to contribute something to the world,
Yeah.
right? And so that's how I've been able to do that is like I had this space that was created that really fostered that type of like it's a different type of leadership, right? Like thought leadership basically for me. And then that's why I've been wanting to give back so much to that community because it's like you taught me a different way to do this that I can still share this part of me and share these insights that I have without having to go through this traditional path. And
Mhm.
also like people willing to publish like in a book to not have a PhD and be published in an academic book. Only one of the other authors on our chapter was pursuing a PhD at the time that we wrote it. So none of us were like professors. Like we were just
Right.
people who had done the research,
Right.
done the work. We cared about it, and someone was able to foster that for us. So I think it's becoming more common, but it's hard. Like universities are very slow to change, especially like really well known institutions like we went to McGill or the University of Toronto or things like that. So it's great to see it happening, but I think students need to also like demand this a little bit more instead of continuing to go down the traditional like do well, go to the next level, and then complete my degree.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's funny because I didn't plan to go to undergrad and then due to some circumstances and shifts, I went and did an undergrad and I never thought I would go back to school. And then I went and did a master's, but that was in a very different kind of vein of why and what I was doing. And what you spoke about of having what I would say is like credible publication sources that allow for non-tenured professors to be writing for them, I think is actually so important because actually, and this is no shade to pure academics, but I know if I think back to my master's, one of the things that was unique about it is actually a lot of the professors in the program were not full-time professors. They were people out in the business world doing business things and then coming in and teaching a course. And they had a level of academia and they had a level of applied experience. And the value that brought was amazing. And as I said, I think you need both. I think it's great to have both, but I think that there should be more and more opportunities for, as I say, this kind of like reach is very credible, right? Like it's not just that wild west of the internet where I can just write whatever I think and no sources and no verification and it reach a ton of people. And if I'm a good writer, it'll probably influence them, which is not always great. I love freedom of speech, but like there's a lot of crap on the internet. But I like that idea, and I think that that's actually should be where we're going, is that there is an intersection of academia and application. Because I
Yeah.
think in addition to not always being accessible when something is written in a pure academic sense, I think sometimes it does exist in a bit of a vacuum
Mhm.
it can be a little ideological of like, wouldn't it be great? And it's like, yes, and this
Yeah.
is the reality. So how do we live in our reality and still make a difference and still take these insights and information and knowledge? So I would love to hear a little bit more about your book, the chapter. For those listening, I've had an interest in cash economies of gender actually since my undergrad, when in political science, I read about the Grameen Bank and microfinance and how the first loans were given to women in Africa in group. And so I'm hopefully not misquoting that because well, but I'm fascinated by it and still have nowhere near the level of knowledge you have. And I would love for you to just talk about it a little bit for those listening.
Yeah, well, I'd love to. Any opportunity to chat about these things is great. And I think what's been cool about talking about it more is that more people are interested than I thought on like this type of topic. But to give like a high level of what my specific research was on. So I worked with a team of three other researchers, all young women as well. And we had a woman as our supervisor. So that was really awesome. And in 2017 and 2018, we researched a program in Ethiopia called the Productive Safety Net Program, which is a cash and food transfer program for rural households. So these are folks who are living on like farming communities outside of cities and largely impacted by conflict driven and climate change driven food insecurity, right? Like those two things happening at the same time really impacts food sources. And so the program was empowering communities to select recipients. So there were these community councils that were made up of like youth and elderly people, women, people with disabilities, lots of different folks from the communities. And they would determine the need of the community and which households would receive cash and food transfers. So that was a really interesting way of selecting people. Like normally when you hear cash transfer, which is just any distribution of like funds or assets to individuals, usually it's based on like an income level, but there's other criteria. So a lot of people in Canada are familiar with like the child benefit or senior benefits or things like that. People all over the world might be familiar with like reverse income taxes. So like if people earn a certain income, they don't pay taxes on it or they receive money back from the government. That's what a cash transfer is. But usually it's very top down and communities have no say on who gets it. It's just like, this is the criteria. If you meet it, you get it. If you don't. So that's where it came from. And then this chapter actually drew on lots of different cash transfers. So one was in Brazil, one was in Palestine, one was in Jordan. There was also M-Pesa in Kenya, which is not a cash transfer, but it's mobile money transfer. So basically using like SMS, so text messages to send money all over the country, like no bank account required, really accessible. So that's what the chapter was about. It's like, how can we learn lessons from all these really different parts of the world that are targeting completely different communities and come up with a blueprint for how do we do this effectively? And so the main things that I was interested in, obviously my co-authors have other areas that they are experts in, but for me, it was on targeting. So how do we identify recipients in a way that is community based and intersectional? And then also, how do we design the distribution? So there's two camps. Like one is conditional cash transfers. So people have to do something in order to get their cash transfer, and unconditional, which is basically like you meet the criteria, you get the cash. There's no real difference, to be honest. Like all cash transfers do help low income people and help entire economies to grow. But, some governments don't want to give people money for free, which I won't comment on that. But statistically looking at the evidence, there's no real difference whether there's conditions or not. So that's what the chapter talks about is like, how do we use technology to make this better, but also recognize the risks? How are we managing information for millions of people receiving these transfers? How are we making meaningful partnerships with the private sector and with civil society to make sure that these are effective? So that's really what we explored in the book chapter. There's also another publication we did for the Stanford Social Innovation Review that is similar. It talks about those lessons as well. But it's just a really great way to break down those borders and realize that we can learn so much from all of these different places around the world, and that being able to put cash in the hands of people who need it can advance economies for everyone, right? It's not just for them. It's not like a charitable thing. It's actually something that improves economies at scale in countries and regions around the world. And yeah, I think it just challenges people's thinking around poverty and who is poor, and really can be a lot more empowering for communities to make decisions for themselves. And you talked about the Grameen Bank, especially for women. Money in the hands of women is very powerful. It goes very far. It supports entire families, entire communities. So it's important that we think about that and we design our supports in that way. Yeah. And at Shopify, I get to do that, right? Like I work with underrepresented youth and I get to say, like, you don't have equal access to the opportunities that other youth have. So let's even that playing ground. Let's invest in you and invest in your growth so that we can have better outcomes in the end.
I love that. And I think you touched on it, but one thing I want to highlight is it's not charity, it's cr- giving a resource that someone can build on. And people in the types of communities that you're talking about, in many cases, will be some of the most resourceful people
Yeah.
that I've met. And I remember when I was studying this and more recently getting more and more involved in social impact venture capital in Latin America. Yeah, it's not about, okay, we're just going to keep giving money to prop something up. It's how do you give money to the right people in the right way so that they can create something and they create a platform and then they are building for themselves, their families, and their communities, and often in ways that those of us coming from more resourced communities probably could never do, right? Like
Absolutely.
what they can make from such something very small and build upon. And it's frankly incredible. And I think there's a lot for us to learn from that as well. So
Definitely. Yeah. And it's so cool. The work that you're doing as well is like really interesting. And I know that the Latin American region is one of the leaders in cash transfer programs, right? Like Bolsa Familia in Brazil, which was one of the cases, it's like probably the most famous cash transfer program in the world. So Latin America is doing incredible things when it comes to that. And especially for entrepreneurship, I think like for women's entrepreneurship, there's been really interesting work that's being done. So it's so cool that you're involved in it.
yeah, it's definitely getting there. I'm very excited to get more involved. And I think even when I look at something like the venture capital organizations, that the funds that are impact focused, that are really looking at investing in startups that are focused on the bottom of the pyramid, under resourced, it's fascinating the different ways, like creating like a bankless cash app for taxi drivers so that they're not driving around with huge amounts of cash, which is like not safe and all kinds of other reasons, and creating parallel credit systems so that people who would not be able to get credit from traditional banks and sources can build credit within a different system so that they can access education, buy houses, like whatever the things I want to say so many of us take for granted, or so many of us just think are never going to be accessible, depending on
Yeah.
where we come from, right? And like bridging that gap, I think is fascinating. I want to ask the question that I think everyone the thinking is probably thinking. How do you do this all the time to have all of you have this job, which is you're in a managerial role at Shopify doing important projects and managing teams. You are doing research and writing articles and books. I know just from knowing you that you are speaking on stages literally all over the world. How do you do it all?
That's a good question. I won't have the best answer because it's always a work in progress, but I will say at the beginning of this kind of journey, which I would say like this journey started probably about 6 years ago or 7 years ago, like my mid-20s, I said yes to everything and it was not sustainable. So at the beginning, it was very much like, sure, I'll do this, I'll apply for this. I won't be afraid of getting rejected from this. I'm going to do everything. And part of that came from being a little bit of like a late bloomer in that sense. Like in my undergrad, I didn't do a lot of stuff. Like I wasn't that involved in things. I didn't go on exchanges. I just went to school, went to work. Like I was working 27 hours a week while also taking 5 courses. And that's it. Like I didn't really focus so much on this part of my career growth because I did think of jobs as just like, this is what I do. And then I go home and I don't think about this anymore. Right. So at first it was just like saying yes to everything. That was not sustainable, especially as I got older. So the way that I manage things now is that one is I've created such a great community that if there's an opportunity that comes up, I don't have to take it. I can just say, like, I know this really incredible person that you probably didn't think of, but they would do an incredible job. So it's like paying it forward in that way. I think that's an important part of mentoring is like you can't take up all the opportunities. You need to be able to like pass those on to other people. So a big part of it was like learning how to say no to certain things and then being able to refer those opportunities to like super incredible deserving people who are way better at that specific topic or role than me. That's one of the ways I've changed my approach. The second one is that I do set boundaries. There's time periods that are really busy and I just can't take on extra things. And there's other times when it's like, you know what, I'm available. I can do this. I can commit to this. So I think practicing like setting those boundaries is important. A big part of that is like, I know that March will be really busy because it's Women's History Month. And so I'll do a bunch of stuff during that month. And then we're just talking about this, like April is going to be a little bit more of my like recovery month to get back to a place where I can say yes again. So making sure to plan for those ebbs and flows is really important. But then the third part is that I'm really fortunate both like with the people I work with in my day job and all of the people I work with outside of that, that we have fostered really great relationships. So I can say that I can't accommodate something at this time, but they know that I'll deliver on the things that I said that I would do. So it's like you fostered that reliability, you have like that clear communication. And so you know that you are accountable and they know that you're going to deliver. So that's something that's also really important. It takes time. Like you have to prove yourself. You can't just like show up thinking people are going to like trust everything that you do. But once you foster those really good relationships that you have like that shared kind of accountability and you can set those boundaries, which is important. And like, you know what that's like. You work with tons of clients. So like, you know that you build trust with them. And then that's where you can carve out the right space for all the different things you do.
Yeah. I think I love what you said. I think it really comes down to a degree of like building your incredible, you are incredible, your credibility and integrity, right?
Yeah,
Because integrity is like when you say yes, you will do it. And if something comes up and then you let people know in advance that like, hey, I said this, but like something has come up and actually it's going to be that,
yeah,
like that's also integrity, right? Like it doesn't mean like at all costs you have to do the thing. But
yeah.
I think to your point, it's like fostering that, demonstrating that when to say yes, when to say no. And I love that you said like say yes to everything and then slowly filtering that down and learning how to say no or hand things off or say not right now.
Exactly.
I do think that is important, right? Like, no matter what you're doing in life, if you want to do great things, there is a period of just like getting your reps
Yeah.
in the connection. And I've been through that in different components of my life. I've had a lot of pivots
Mhm.
where, cool, I'm in my yes phase. And that's exciting. And at the same time, like at this point, I will start to be more discerning. And I know there's times in my life, and I know a lot of people who are quite far along in their current cycle of whatever they're doing, where it's like they're in the no phase, right? And it's almost a no for everything. And I think
Yeah,
it harkens a little bit back to what you were talking about good examples and not so good examples of leaders is like you need to know what your no's are. And that's so
exactly.
powerful in order to focus your energy and your resources towards the yes that is like so aligned. But you are going to have that alignment early on, right? Like early on, your funnel has to be really wide. And then you can narrow
Exactly.
it down as you're going and be more selective. And to your point, you have again, build a community. I love the theme where you're able to not just say no, which is fine, but to actually refer and divert and support and foster opportunities for others, which amazing.
It's like the most fun part of it. It's like being able to pay it forward, right? I think that's what fills your cup a lot of the time. I didn't do this just for myself. Like I'm doing this for a huge group of people and they're going to do it for the you kind of like next generation of people as well, which is like that's the fun part of being a leader.
Yeah, I love that. So, two things as we're wrapping up. The first one is what, looking back at, you said you were a late bloomer, which is like, I was like, yeah, mid-20s, getting involved and getting your shit together. Like most people aren't there yet. But looking back, what advice would you give people who do want to curate their career in an unconventional way?
Yeah, this is like thinking of what advice I would have wanted at that point. It's similar to what we just talked about. So one of the pieces of advice is just being open to things that you wouldn't traditionally do. I think I'm the type of person who learns by doing, and I think a lot of people are. And it's like, if you don't try, you'll never know, right? Don't talk yourself out of things. So that's like the biggest advice I can give is that even if something seems like, oh, I'm not really qualified for this, or I picked this path and this is interesting to me. Like, just go for it. You may get rejected. That's part of the journey, but you do have to try. If you don't, then that opportunity goes by and you never see it again. So I think that the first piece is like, even if something seems out of the realm of like your expertise or the path that you've chosen, just try it out. See if you like it. Don't let opportunities pass you by. That like you said, that part of just saying yes to everything is a part of it and it can be exhausting, but it also leads you to a place where you can curate this life or this career that you really love and that really is motivating for you. So that's the first piece of advice. The second one is finding lots of mentors, sponsors, allies that can support you. Cause, we talked about this in the leadership advice is you should never be doing things on your own. Like you should have people who have done this before, who can give you advice, who can counsel you, who can even just like review an application or practice an interview with you. Those types of things are really important. And building that trust is an exercise you have to get used to because you do it in so many different spaces. So that's the two pieces of advice is like try it out, say yes, don't be afraid of getting rejected, just go for it. And then fostering that sense of community, mentorship, allyship, so that you have a support system because it can be really lonely if you don't have people you can rely on. And then you also can't become a good mentor if you don't have a good mentor. So I think that's an important advice as well.
Yeah. So I love to end our interviews with a few rapid fire questions just for people to get to know you outside of the topics that we've talked about today. They are quick. You can pass, whatever works for you. There's just four of them. So you ready?
I did. Yes, I can't wait.
I love it. Okay. So the first one is what experience has changed your life?
Ooh, I feel like a lot of experiences have changed my life, but I think in the context of this discussion, the experience that really changed my life was quitting my job, doing a master's degree in a different city and just being like, well, you'll figure it out. I actually like only applied for one program and I was like, if I don't get in, then it's not meant to be. And if I do, I'm uprooting my whole life and doing it. So that was almost like giving me 0 or 1. Like there's no spectrum. It's just like a yes or no. That was a big turning point for me for sure. I have lots, but that's like in this journey, that's been a big one.
I love it. What does the term strategy mean to you?
Ooh, I really like this because I think of myself as a very strategic person. I like even just like strategic board games or video games and stuff. I love that type of stuff. But strategy for me really is like the perspective that you're going to apply to accomplish something. So a lot of people think it has to be really complicated, but for me, it's really just like, how am I going to think about this problem or how am I going to tackle this goal? And so creating a strategy for even the smallest things. You don't have to put like the capital S on that, but thinking strategically, understanding what you want to accomplish, understanding what you want to get out of an experience or a goal. That's like what strategy is for me.
I love that. You don't have to put a capital S on it. Wow. What is a book that has changed your perspective?
Oh, trying to think. I read a lot of books, so I feel like this is a challenging one. But mm, I remember in my undergrad, actually, it was James Scott, I think, who wrote this book called Moral Economy of the Peasant, which is not the loveliest name. But the book is just about how people have like small acts of resistance in their day to day life when they experience injustice, and how it can be like really simple things that actually lead to like larger systemic changes. So even though I didn't really love the book because it's very like textbook-y, like it's not like a fun read or anything, I think that message really stuck with me of like your actions don't have to be huge, but they can still make an impact and contribute to like a bigger movement or change. And I think especially like with this type of social impact work, it can feel like daunting if you're not making like a big impact. But these kind of small gradual changes are super important and they make a difference.
I love that. All right. And the last one is, if you could go to any concert tomorrow, touring or not, dead or alive, what would it be?
Oh, this is such a good question. And I love, like, I'm a big music person. I'm trying to think of exactly the one. The first thing that's coming to mind is Fleetwood Mac. And the reason why is because my mom and my grandparents went to that concert without me in Montreal. And I think about it to this day of like how pissed I am that they didn't take me with them. So I think that would probably be it. I would want to like rewind to that exact concert date and join them because I feel like it would have been really nice.
I love that. Sydney, thank you so much. Where can people find your book or maybe connect with causes that you're working with if they want to know more?
Great question. And thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation. If folks want to reach out, of course, like connecting with me on LinkedIn, Sydney Piggott. I post a lot more now. I took a little break. That's one of the boundaries I set. But now I'm like out here posting all of the stuff I'm working on. Our book is available at the University of Toronto Press. It's called Cash Transfers for Inclusive Society. So you can find it there. And we just contributed to one chapter. There's all these incredible chapters. So highly recommend. Yeah. And I'm Sydney Piggott on everything like Instagram, X, all the different things. So please reach out. And if folks also have thoughts or read the chapter or any of the articles, I love to hear from people. So reach out to me, let me know your thoughts. I love to chat about cash transfers and inclusion.
Amazing. Thank you for taking the time today. It's been such a joy to talk to you, and we'll have to do it again soon.
For sure. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in. Our goal is to create connections and inspire conversations about building great companies. So please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast with your network. Sharing is caring. If you're a business leader or executive team ready to take your leadership and company to the next level with high-performing teams, we'd love to see how we can rocket fuel your growth. Check out the show notes to book your free Builders Business Booster call, where you'll receive a strategic leadership assessment and 3 concrete focus areas to mature and grow your business. You'll also find the link to join the Builders Club to stay up to date on upcoming events, get valuable tools and insights, as well as be the first to receive exciting announcements straight to your inbox. No spam, I promise. You'll also find my website, alexsnyder.com, and all the places to peep my creds, hear what clients have to say, and see if I went to the gym today. And one final note, this podcast is not intended to be legal, tax, or other professional advice. Thanks for joining. We'll catch you on the flip side.